The winter of 1885 had come early to Wyoming, and it had come with a vengeance. It was a season of iron and ice, where the wind screamed down from the mountains like a living thing, looking for any crack in the walls to let the cold in. Arthur Thorne owned nearly everything the eye could see in this valley, 1,000 acres of timber and pasture that lay buried under 3 feet of snow. He was a wealthy man by the standards of the territory, with a herd of strong cattle and a ranch house built of thick pine logs that could withstand a siege. But inside that big house, Arthur was a pauper. The rooms were hollow, filled only with the silence that had settled in 5 years ago, right after his wife, Mary, had passed from a fever. Since then, Arthur had become a man of few words and even fewer smiles, letting the ranch work consume him until he was as hard and weathered as the fence posts marking his land. The silence was heavy, pressing down on his chest in the long, dark evenings. The work was too much for one man, even a man as strong as Arthur, especially with the winter deepening. That was why he had ridden into the town of Coldwater a week prior. He hadn't spoken to anyone more than necessary. He simply walked into the general store, wrote a note on a scrap of paper, and tacked it to the community board. It read, "Farmhand wanted, hard labor, room and board provided, C.A. Thorne." He had ridden back home expecting a drifter to show up eventually. He imagined some grizzled wanderer, a man with calloused hands and a past he wanted to hide, someone willing to shovel snow and mend fences for a hot meal and a roof. What Arthur did not expect, what nothing in his life could have prepared him for, was the figure that appeared at the edge of his property line as the sun began to dip below the peaks. It was late afternoon, and the sky was turning a bruised purple, threatening more snow. Arthur was standing on his porch, a mug of bitter coffee in his hand, when he saw a smudge of darkness moving against the blinding white of the snowfield. At first, he thought it was a wolf, perhaps sick or desperate, driven out of the timber by hunger. He set his coffee down and reached for the rifle he kept leaning by the door. But as the figure drew closer, staggering through the drifts, the shape changed. It was too tall to be a wolf, yet too erratic to be a man. Arthur pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, jammed his hat onto his head, and stepped off the porch. The snow crunched loudly under his boots, a stark contrast to the silence of the valley. He walked with long, purposeful strides, the rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. As he closed the distance, the figure stumbled and fell, face first, into the snow. It didn't move. When Arthur reached the fallen shape, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a drifter. It wasn't a hardened cowboy. It was a woman. She was small, incredibly slight, and she was wearing a dress made of thin, gray silk, a style he had never seen before, with a high collar and slits up the sides. It offered absolutely no protection against a Wyoming winter. The wind whipped her raven black hair across her face, which was pale and tinged with the blue of hypothermia. But what stopped Arthur's heart cold were her feet. She was barefoot. Her feet were raw, bleeding, and frozen, leaving a trail of faint red stains in the snow behind her. She had walked miles in this condition. He dropped to his knees beside her, the rifle forgotten in the snow. He turned her over gently. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy with exhaustion. She didn't look scared. She looked like someone who had already accepted the end. "Help," she whispered, the word barely a puff of steam in the freezing air. Arthur didn't say a word. He scooped her up into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in silk. The cold radiating off her body soaked instantly through his heavy coat. He turned and ran back toward the house, his boots pounding a frantic rhythm. He kicked the front door open and carried her inside, straight to the massive stone hearth where a fire was already dying down. He placed her in the big armchair, the one that used to be Mary's. He moved with a speed he didn't know he still possessed, throwing logs onto the fire and blowing on the embers until the flames roared back to life. The heat washed over the room, but the woman was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering so hard it was a terrifying sound in the quiet room. Arthur went to the linen chest and pulled out 2 thick wool blankets, wrapping them tightly around her until only her face was visible. He rushed to the kitchen stove, where a pot of coffee sat. He poured a cup, black and scalding, and brought it to her. Her hands emerged from the blankets, delicate, bruised, and shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't hold the cup. Arthur wrapped his large, rough hands around hers, steadying the mug, and helped her guide it to her lips. She drank greedily, the heat seeming to shock some life back into her eyes. "You need a doctor," Arthur rumbled. His voice sounded rusty to his own ears. He hadn't spoken aloud in days. The woman shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "No, doctor," she rasped. Her accent was thick, unfamiliar. "No money. I work." Arthur stared at her. He looked at the silk dress that was torn at the hem, at the bruises on her arms, and at her frozen feet resting on his hearthstone. "Work?" he repeated, incredulous. "Ma'am, you can barely stand. What kind of work do you think you can do out here?" She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw a flash of steel in her dark eyes. "I cook, I clean, I strong, I work for stay." He looked at her for a long moment. He had asked for a farmhand, and the universe had sent him a half-frozen tragedy. But he couldn't turn her out. Not in this weather, not with those feet. "We'll see," he muttered. "Drink your coffee." The unspoken agreement settled over the house like the snow on the roof. Arthur slept fitfully that night in his room, listening for any sound from the main room. He woke before dawn, expecting to find her dead or gone. Instead, he woke to a smell he hadn't smelled in 5 years. Fresh bread. He walked into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The woman was there. She was standing on her bandaged feet. She must have torn up an old sheet during the night to bind them, and was kneading dough on the table. She had found his flour and yeast. The kitchen floor, usually tracked with mud and dust, was swept clean. The stove was polished. She looked up when he entered. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts over her silk dress. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. "Porridge is hot," she said, nodding toward the stove. Arthur sat down, stunned. He ate the oatmeal she placed before him. It was simple, but hot and well made. She didn't sit with him. She stood by the stove, eating from a small bowl, watching him warily. "My name is Arthur," he said, putting his spoon down. "Lynn," she replied softly. "My name is Lynn." After breakfast, Arthur went into the back room, the one he kept shut. It smelled of lavender and old memories. He opened the cedar chest and pushed aside a quilt to find a pair of sturdy leather work boots. They were small. Mary had small feet, but good quality. He hesitated, his thumb tracing the worn leather, memories threatening to choke him. Then he took a breath and carried them out. He set them down next to Lynn. "Put these on," he said gruffly, turning away so she wouldn't see his face. "Can't work in bare feet." He went out to the barn then, into the biting cold, leaving her alone. When she came out an hour later to help him, she was wearing the boots. They were a little big, but she had stuffed the toes with wool. She walked with a limp, but she walked. The days turned into weeks, and a routine formed. It was a rhythm dictated by the rising and setting of the sun. Arthur expected her to stay inside, to do the cooking and cleaning, which she did with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. The house, once a dusty tomb, became a home again. Windows were washed, floors were scrubbed, and clothes were mended. But Lynn insisted on doing more. She followed him outside, wrapped in his old coats. She learned to break the ice on the water troughs for the cattle. She learned to fork hay. She wasn't strong in the way a man was, but she had leverage and determination. She never complained, not once. She worked until her hands were raw, and when he told her to stop, she would just shake her head and keep going. One evening, Arthur came in from checking the fence line, shaking the snow from his hat. He hung his heavy coat by the door and noticed something. The large tear in the shoulder, where a barb from a wire fence had ripped it open months ago, was gone. He picked up the coat and looked closely. The tear had been mended with tiny, intricate stitches, so fine they were almost invisible. It was stronger than the original fabric. He looked over at Lynn, who was sitting by the fire, mending a sock. "You fix this?" he asked. She nodded without looking up. "Wind get in. Make you cold." Arthur ran his thumb over the stitching. It was a small act of care, but it hit him harder than a punch to the gut. No one had cared if he was cold in a very long time. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "You gave me boots," she said simply. The real test came when supplies ran low. They had to go into town. Arthur was reluctant to take her. The town of Coldwater was small, and small towns had small minds, but he couldn't leave her alone at the ranch, not with the wolves prowling closer to the house each night. He hitched up the sleigh. Lynn came out wearing Mary's old winter cloak, the hood pulled low over her face. She climbed onto the seat beside him, and they set off in silence. When they pulled up to the general store in Coldwater, the reaction was immediate. Men stopped their conversations on the boardwalk to stare. It wasn't often they saw Arthur Thorne, and they certainly never saw him with a woman, especially not a woman who looked like Lynn. Arthur helped her down, ignoring the whispers. They walked into the store. Mr. Abernathy, the shopkeeper, peered over his spectacles, his jaw dropping slightly. "Afternoon, Abernathy," Arthur said, pulling a list from his pocket. "Need flour, coffee, sugar, and kerosene." Abernathy didn't move to get the items. He was staring at Lynn, who stood slightly behind Arthur, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I heard you hired a hand, Thorne," Abernathy sneered. "Didn't know you were hiring this kind of help." Two other men by the potbelly stove chuckled. One of them, a ranch hand named Miller, stepped forward. "She don't look like much of a worker," Miller laughed. "What exactly does she do for you out there all alone, Thorne?" The implication hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Lynn shrank back, her shoulders hunching as if she expected a blow. Arthur turned slowly. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and heavy with muscle earned from a lifetime of labor. He looked at Miller, his eyes cold and flat. The store went deadly silent. Arthur didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He stepped between Lynn and the men, blocking her from their view entirely. "She works harder than you ever have in your life, Miller," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. "She is the only person on this earth with the grit to survive a winter on my land." He turned his gaze to the shopkeeper. "Now, my supplies, or I take my business to the next county." Abernathy scrambled to fill the order. The other men looked at the floor, suddenly finding their boots very interesting. When they walked out, Arthur carried the heavy sacks, and he made sure Lynn walked in front of him, protected. On the ride home, the silence between them had changed. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of allies. Arthur focused on the horses, his jaw set tight. He felt a hand on his arm. He looked down to see Lynn's gloved hand resting on his sleeve. "They are bad men," she said quietly. "There are bad men everywhere, Lynn," Arthur replied, "but they won't bother you, not while I'm breathing." She looked at him then, her dark eyes wide and searching. "Why you do that? Defend me?" Arthur looked out at the snowy horizon. "Because you're with me, and folks on the Thorne Ranch look out for their own." Their own. The words hung in the frosty air. Lynn squeezed his arm gently, then let go, but she sat a little closer to him for the rest of the ride. February brought a false thaw, followed by the worst storm the territory had seen in decades. The sky turned a sickly gray, and the temperature plummeted until the air itself felt like shattered glass. They were out in the north pasture when the storm hit. A heifer had broken through a weak spot in the fence and wandered into a ravine to calve. They found her, but the calf was already born, wet and freezing in the snow. "We have to get them back," Arthur shouted over the rising wind. He picked up the calf, tucking it inside his coat against his chest. Lynn grabbed the heifer's halter, pulling her forward, but the storm descended with terrifying speed. Within minutes, they couldn't see 5 feet in front of them. The snow was a blinding white wall, and the wind roared like a freight train. "We can't make the house," Arthur yelled, grabbing Lynn's shoulder to keep her from wandering off the invisible path. "The line shack, it's closer." They fought their way through the drifts, blind and freezing. Lynn stumbled again and again, but Arthur kept a grip on her, dragging her up, urging her forward. They found the small log cabin by pure luck, looming out of the whiteout. They tumbled inside, slamming the door against the gale. The shack was tiny, just a single room with a stone fireplace and a stack of dry wood. It was freezing, but it was out of the wind. Arthur immediately set to work building a fire, while Lynn rubbed the shivering calf with a burlap sack. Once the fire caught, the small room began to warm. They were trapped. The storm outside was a killer. There was no leaving until it broke. That night, huddled near the fire, the barrier between them finally crumbled. They sat on the floor, sharing a piece of dried beef and a canteen of water. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of how fragile their lives were. "I thought I would die before I met you," Lynn said softly. She was staring into the flames. "My village. Back home. There was a fire. Bandits. I lost everyone. My husband. My baby." Arthur turned to look at her, his heart aching. He had suspected a tragedy, but seeing the pain in her eyes was almost unbearable. "I came to America because I had nowhere else," she continued. "I walked. I worked. I ran away from bad men. I walked until my shoes fell apart. I saw your light in the snow that night. I thought it was heaven, or maybe hell. I didn't care." Arthur reached out and took her hand. It was rough now, calloused from the ranch work, but still so small in his. "I lost my wife, Mary, 5 years ago," he confessed, his voice rasping. "Since she died, I've just been waiting for the winter to finally take me, I suppose. The house was so quiet. I hated the quiet." He squeezed her hand. "But it's not quiet anymore. You brought the life back, Lynn. You saved me just as much as I saved you." Lynn looked at him, tears streaming down her face, reflecting the firelight. "I am not just a farmhand?" she asked, her voice trembling. Arthur shook his head slowly. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "No, you're not just a farmhand. You're the best thing that's happened to this ranch. To me." She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. "I want to stay," she whispered. "Forever." "Then you stay," Arthur said firmly. "This is your home, as long as you want it." The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the shack, they kept the fire going and kept the calf alive. They talked for hours, sharing stories of the worlds they came from, one of rice paddies and mountains in the east, the other of dust and cattle in the west. They were two broken people from opposite ends of the earth, brought together by the snow. When the storm finally broke, the sun came out, blinding and brilliant. The world was buried in white, peaceful and still. Arthur pushed the door of the shack open and squinted against the light. They walked back to the main house slowly, leading the heifer and the calf, which Lynn had named Lucky. The ranch house stood tall against the blue sky, smoke still curling faintly from the chimney where the coals had held. That evening the routine resumed, but everything was different. When dinner was ready, Lynn didn't stand by the stove. She set 2 places at the table, side by side. Arthur sat down and watched her pour the tea. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had retrieved from the cedar chest earlier that afternoon. It was a simple silver locket that had belonged to his mother. He placed it on the table in front of her. Lynn looked at it, then up at him, her eyes shining. "I'm going to take down that notice in town tomorrow," Arthur said, his voice gruff but warm. "Don't need a farmhand anymore." Lynn smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up the kitchen brighter than the lantern ever could. "No," she agreed, picking up the locket. "You have a partner." Arthur Thorne, the wealthy cowboy who had thought his life was over, took a sip of his tea and looked at the woman who had walked out of the snow and into his heart. Outside, the Wyoming winter was still harsh and cold, but inside, for the first time in years, it was warm.